Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Tech Tuesday webinar. My name is Kevin Marhoney, and I am the host of our Tech Tuesday webinar series. Joining me today is Chris Shalda, one of our great solution architects here at Cortex Service. He is kicking off his multi-part running SQL and Azure series today. So he's prepared a lot of great content here, and there will be more to come. But before we go ahead and let Chris run through what he has here to present today, just a couple of really quick housekeeping items. As we're going through the presentation today, if you do have any questions, we do have the Q&A feature enabled. So up in the right-hand corner of your team screen, there should be a little question mark there that you can click on and go ahead and have access to that. When you're in there, you should see the announcement I made earlier about when we would be getting started here today. But if you do have any questions, feel free to click that, enter in your questions there, and we do save some time here at the end to go over those. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so whether you want to come back and review the material that Chris has presented here today, or if it's your first time viewing it on demand, we will be making this recording available to everybody who registered for the event. And as part of that, we'll also send out the slide deck so you can review any of the info that Chris has presented on. With those two boring items out of the way, Chris, I will go ahead and open it up to you and let you run through the presentation you've prepared.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Welcome. And yeah, really looking forward to this webinar series. SQL comes up a lot in my discussions with customers, so I want to share a lot of the knowledge around that. So quick introduction about me. So my name is Chris Shalda. I'm our Senior Solutions Architect at Cortex Services for our cloud solutions. So that mainly covers Azure and also Microsoft 365, kind of modern desktop, modern management as well. I've been at Cortex now 14 years and the solution architect around those cloud solutions covering Microsoft for the last 5 or 6 years now. So had the pleasure of working with many customers. I think it was dozens of customers in the Azure space, everywhere from large enterprises to small, medium businesses to SaaS providers or ISVs. So have a lot of great kind of experience and stories, that type of thing that hopefully I can share with you all around SQL and Azure. So with that, we kind of get started here into the agenda. What we're going to try to cover today is going to be more of an overview, kind of kicking off this series. So to start with, I do want to talk about, why would you run SQL in Azure? What are the compelling reasons of doing that? And then after that, get into what are those specific options for running SQL in Azure. We're not necessarily going to cover every single little there's a lot of things you can do with SQL and Azure, but kind of the main ones that I see a lot of our customers taking advantage of. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into those ones, and I'll tell you what those are at that point. And then I want to get you started on, kind of high level of what does a SQL to Azure migration strategy look like. And I say high level because, as you'll see in the next topic, on our future topics in this series, we're going to go deeper into some of these areas. But I want to kind of just get everybody's kind of appetite whetted a little bit as we start here. And give you an idea of kind of where we're going and high level here. So, and at the end, we will have questions. If you have questions, again, put those in the Q&A, and we'll let you know how Cortex can help you on this cloud journey. So before we get started here, letting you know that we do have other kind of webinars in our series for Tech Tuesdays out on YouTube, so please check it out. Kind of give you a little screenshot of this, and be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can get notifications when we come out with new videos. We try to do them at least about once a week, so keep your eyes out. All right, so let's get this kicked off. Why would we run SQL in Azure? Right. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is probably more geared towards those of you that have SQL already or using SQL in your app with your applications on-prem today, and not necessarily of building brand new applications, although some of this may apply. So just want to kind of set that context. But assuming you have SQL on-prem today, or maybe you have some other type of database and you may be looking to use SQL, this is where we're really going to key in on. So big thing is there's definitely a number of migration and modernization triggers that could be on your mind of what might kind of lead you to move your SQL workloads to Azure. So for instance, you may need to upgrade an application, replace aging hardware, keep up with the latest regulatory or industry security and compliance standards, avoid end of support, or you just desire to modernize your business with new technology so you can better serve your customers and employees. But regardless of the motivation, all sides of businesses can benefit from the improved total cost of ownership, security, and compliance features, certifications, and innovative database services that can help basically transform your applications and your business. So kind of breaking that down here, first off is cost savings. With Azure, you pay for what you use. You can use pay-as-you-go pricing, pay by the minute for what you use. You can quickly spin up new servers, and during slow times, you spin those servers back down. And for stable long-term workloads, you can even purchase SQL Server subscriptions, get reserved capacity pricing for your infrastructure, basically allowing you to lock in the best rates available. So all this plus the savings in the database administration and management, it really leads to a lot of savings, especially in some of these areas like with Azure SQL Managed Instance or Azure SQL Database. So in fact, Forrester found that migrating a managed instance has anticipated an ROI of 212%, a payback period as little as 6 months, which is really great. So, and I am going to be mentioning a few of these things first, so bear with me around, like, we're going to hear things like SQL on VM, so that's your traditional SQL. You're going to hear things like managed instance and Azure SQL Database. We're going to dig into those in the next section. But other things too, there's unmatched security and availability. So really ensuring you're doing security monitoring and getting threat protection. Think about it this way: is the cloud more secure than your own servers? Right? I mean, over 50% of just small businesses in the U.S. have suffered a data breach, and Microsoft spends actually $1 billion. That's a billion with a B, right? Annually on security, and they have a team of 3,500 security specialists dedicated to fighting security attacks. And really, by using these services, you're putting them to work to safeguard your business with just unmatched security monitoring and threat protection. And protecting your data and maintaining business continuity is possible with built-in high availability business continuity tools. And also Azure's financially backed 99.99% availability SLA for these services. It's powered by a global network of Microsoft managed data centers. It also gives you the ability to do flexible modernization. So you can add cloud innovation at your own pace. So not saying that out of the gate, you have to go to some of these more modernized PaaS-like services, but you can run your SQL Server workloads on premise and in the cloud at the same time, and then you can shift to some of the more modernized services kind of on your own time. And the Azure SQL Database, it has the same features as SQL Server, and it works with your existing applications and skill sets. So really, you're able to use the same familiar tools on-prem and in the cloud as you migrate on your own schedule. And lastly, you're able to really streamline your IT resources and open yourself up for unparalleled innovation. So think about it. If you could spend less time running servers and more time running your business, that really would add a lot of impact, right? So with Azure, you can operate the server, and basically Azure operates the server and storage infrastructure for you, so you can focus on the apps and data that add value to your customers' employees. So with more than 100 on-demand services and tools, Azure really makes it really easy to run existing server apps, or build innovative new apps even to build to better serve your customers. So digging into these a little bit more here, right? So really showing that 212% ROI or more potentially with SQL managed instance, really versus an on-prem and other hosted alternatives. So this is really according to a recent total economic impact report by Forrester. So organizations, you can experience this cumulative net benefit of over, I mean, this is kind of like based off these size customers, right? Nearly $2.2 million over a 3-year period. It really comes down to lowering your operational costs, redirecting resources to more value-added projects, relying on this fully managed solution that requires near zero administration for patching or upgrading, minimizing IT administrative costs, and reducing capital and operational costs associated with maintaining on-prem or hosted databases. And lastly, you now shrink costs associated with re-architecting apps for the cloud because Microsoft makes it really easy to get there. And around security and compliance, which is, I know, a big deal for a lot of customers that we have, especially a lot of them is in more of those regulated industries. It comes down to, I mean, just how exactly can we say that Azure SQL Managed Instance provides unmatched security and compliance for SQL? Well, first of all, there's built-in support for security features like firewall, virtual networks, Azure Active Directory integration that allows you to extend your current network security to the cloud. SQL Database can encrypt and obscure data at use, if it's in use and at rest, protecting your data from internal and external eyes with features like always encrypted and dynamic data masking. And customers can also proactively monitor for vulnerabilities and threats with intelligent advanced threat protection. It's really trained using machine learning to analyze security threats data for the millions of SQL databases running in Azure. So you get to take advantage of all those signals that Microsoft's seeing and put those to work for you to protect your data. And really, Azure offers the broadest set of compliance offerings of any cloud that's out there. It's including SOC, ISO, HIPAA. And finally, customers running apps on, if you're still running apps on SQL Server 2008 or 2008 R2, that is now end of support. You do not get any security updates if that's still running on-prem. You can stay protected with up to 3 years of extended security updates for free in Azure. Now, I think we're about 1.5 years in, so you still got about 1.5 years left, but just by virtue of moving your SQL workloads that are on 2008 R2 that you don't want to change anything, you want to mitigate risk, these may be older applications you don't want to mess with, just by moving it to Azure, you are enabled to get additional security updates with that. Now, not only does the Azure SQL Database Managed Instance have a great TCO and security features, but it also reduces the differences between on-prem SQL Server and a fully managed database server, so that the migration becomes a lot easier here. So the idea here is that there's a high level of consistency between your traditional on-prem SQL Server and Azure, and that means that the customers are able to use the same skills when you migrate, really, using familiar tools and features. So Managed Instance can leverage built-in integration across even on-prem and the cloud, using Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, and other Azure services that can work seamlessly with your on-prem applications, networking, and security. And finally, Azure SQL Database and SQL Server are built on the same code, so your app is really going to work the same way. It really is not going to know the difference there. And the Managed Instance eliminates application changes with full SQL Server programming surface, so you can move those SQL Server-based applications to the cloud with ideally very few or no changes. And we'll talk about later on kind of how you would get there. So just to kind of sum up here, right, the Azure SQL Database is a fully managed relational database as a service, and it gives you the best, most economical cloud destination for your SQL Server data. Running this on Microsoft SQL Server Engine means it's highly performing, reliable, and secure. And you can use it to build data-driven applications and websites in the programming language of your choice without needing to manage infrastructure. So as we start getting into this, that was the Managed Instance. The Azure SQL Database side will give you that same type of compatibility. We'll talk about kind of differences there. It gives you competitive TCO, and in some cases, there's an option where you can even have up to 100 terabytes of on-demand scalable storage per database, which is an option that you can select. We'll get into here. And that same security is the same on the Azure SQL Database, as well as built-in intelligence. So now that we kind of have an idea of like, why would we even consider this thing, right? Why would we even consider moving these workloads with SQL into Azure? Now let's talk about what are the options for running SQL in Azure. So to start off with, I want to take a step back, because when we talk about SQL, we're talking about data, we're talking about relational databases, right? But that's just one small piece in the larger data story, right, of the modern data state, as you kind of see here. So I want to kind of give you a broad view of where this fits in. So as you see on the left side, that's your traditional kind of on-prem or private cloud, right? You have operational databases, data warehouses, data lakes, and then you have on the right side the cloud, right? So it's like Azure, where you have the same thing, right? Operational databases, data warehouses, data lakes. And the intent here is that we can have a hybrid connectivity here. So if you have to keep some applications on-prem or in a private cloud now, or some time into the future, you can do that and still leverage capabilities out of the cloud. And what Azure really brings to the table is bringing in these kind of value-added services that are layered on top of what you would typically only get with, the SQL Server itself. You get a lot more with some of these PaaS services. And you still have the flexibility of choice of any language, any platform, anywhere. Microsoft is very dedicated to open source as well, so SQL is not the only option for relational databases. And all the things that you get around security and certifications with Azure applies to these services. So that's just great that that's built in. So if we look at this more closely now, let's see what Microsoft's specific cloud solution is. So today we're going to be talking about really Azure SQL Database for operational databases. You might hear like transactional or relational type databases. That's Azure SQL Database. As well, and it's not really on this slide, but we're going to talk about what it means to have SQL on a VM in Azure too. So running that still in Azure, but on a VM. So that's the main thing here. But for the bigger picture here, there's also Azure Cosmos DB for relational NoSQL data. And a little bit of trivia: NoSQL doesn't mean there's not any SQL. It actually means not only SQL data. So you can actually use SQL APIs to hit Azure Cosmos DB, and there's some really cool features in that. But that's more of probably a re-architecting or rebuilding your app is how you would use Cosmos DB in most cases. And there's also, like I said, there's open source databases such as Azure, MySQL, PostgreSQL, and MariaDB that are PaaS services as well. Another one that's tied pretty closely, we see when you have operational databases like Azure SQL, is going to be data warehouses. So that's going to be what's called Azure Synapse Analytics, formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And that would be for your columnar storage or analytics, kind of historical data might be shipped into that, and you're going to run reports out of there. And then there's the data lake, which that kind of ties into some of this too, more on the analytics side, as well as Databricks and HD Insight for kind of other ways you can do some analytics across that data. All right, so just a little bit more information in here, but essentially we're going to cover a lot of this later on. So here's really the scale of where we're looking at from SQL. You have on the left side the Azure SQL virtual machine, right? And from that perspective, that is going to be pretty much a lift and shift. If you're looking at doing something like that, you are just taking your VMs today, and you're either going to be just basically copying those disks up to Azure and standing up the VM through certain tools, or maybe you stand up a new one, a new SQL Server in Azure, and you just migrate the databases over. Either way, you're going to end up with a VM. So that's your most traditional kind of like place you can go. And yes, while that will work, there's no real changes to your SQL apps or to your SQL server and your databases at all there, you're not going to gain as much of the benefits as going to PaaS, which is on the right side. So on the right side, let's look at the far right, right? Azure SQL Database. So this has been out since, I think Azure was called the Red Dog. This was years and years ago when Azure, before it was called Azure, they had this concept of kind of SQL databases that this is isolated to a database itself and very scalable and this true PaaS service here, where there's really no servers for you to manage here. Now, that was intended, I believe, initially for cloud native applications, for you to build a new application, build it on this, because it does have a little bit kind of smaller, say, feature area in terms of compared to a full-blown SQL Server where you have access to everything, right? To not only the database, but the instance and the server and the file system. So it was great for those use cases of kind of that you're going to re-architect your app or rebuild your app into a way to use Azure SQL Database or just brand new application. However, a lot of customers are like, well, I want to move. I love the idea of that. I want to move my SQL, like traditional SQL databases that are on a VM. I want to move into Azure SQL Database. Well, what most customers found is that because of the feature differences there, and just that you only have visibility into the database level and not the instance or the server or the file system, a lot of those SQL databases were not compatible to be moved over there. You wouldn't be able to use a lot of the features you might be used to. Which I'll get to some of those later on. So Microsoft, what they did is developed kind of this middle ground here of, okay, well, let's create a PaaS service. So customers still do not have to manage any servers, but they get the advantages of PaaS, of the security, some of the intelligence that are built in, the scale, that type of thing, and just not having to do the patching. Just that itself is huge. So they created Azure SQL Managed Instance. So a little more recent development. I think it's still years old, but it's the newest one on this screen based on what you can do with that is with SQL and Azure. And this bridges the gap to allow you to, in a lot of cases, not have to make any changes to your existing SQL databases to move them into a SQL Managed Instance. Some cases there's some minor things you have to change, and a lot of that's tied to Microsoft's put out guidance around best practices, things that you shouldn't do. Things have been deprecated, yet you can still use them on SQL Server. Some of those are maybe you got to get away from that, dig yourself out a little bit of technical debt, right, to get here. But this has a tremendous amount of benefits, and which we'll get into as well. So I just want to give you an idea of the landscape here of what we're talking about. Okay, and so from an Azure SQL database, now the idea here is that we can use things like the database migration service to migrate multiple sources at scale to accelerate the transition to the cloud. You can have these connected to your virtual network with support from managed instance, fully managed security. So it actually has a private IP address. It's not just hanging out on the public internet like that used to be your only option before. Is that it kind of was hanging out on the public internet and you had to put all these kind of whitelists together to allow only what you needed. It was a little difficult to manage, especially when it had to connect with other applications that are sitting in your virtual network. And managed instance kind of combines that best of the SQL Server with the operational financial benefits of the cloud. So like I said, it's kind of that middle ground there. Still get the PaaS capabilities, but you have some of the great compatibility with SQL Server. So when we talk about kind of Azure SQL options here, we're going to break it down one step further. You're going to have the single database of Azure SQL Database. So that is scoped for a single database there, and you assign resources for that workload with very, typically use that with very predictable workload performance. And then the next step up, which is really just a bunch of those single databases, basically two or more, in an elastic pool. So what you do is you set the resources for that entirety of the pool of whatever databases. You can set some limits in terms of how much each database can have, but it's really sharing all that, because in a situation where you have ups and downs a lot, and it's like multi-tenant applications, and it's really unpredictable type of workload performance, so you want to get the best bang for the buck, you can use something like Elastic Pool. It's much like you think about virtualization and using that as having VMs on a physical host. Same idea here is that you have multiple databases in an Elastic Pool that can give you a little bit better cost benefits there for those types of applications. Then the right side is managed instance. So this is scoped at the instance level. So on a managed instance, you can have up to 100 databases on that, right? So think of that as a full instance there. Now on a SQL Server, you might have multiple instances, right? But in this case, it's a single instance. So you have visibility at the instance level and at the database level, which that really gives you the high compatibility with SQL servers. Is really having that instance level visibility. And so getting into the database, SQL Database Managed Instance, again, it's full SQL service area. In fact, what I understand is that Microsoft's actually building SQL code for their next release, releases of SQL Server on these services first, and then bringing them down to the SQL servers that you have on-prem. So it's actually being done at scale in Azure first, and then being brought down. And what I've understood, I've talked to some of the SQL engineers on the product team, that they basically are saying that they're not going to have any sort of features that are going to be like completely removed as we're moving forward, so that you will have kind of like forward compatibility with everything that you're trying to do here. Because this is an evergreen service, so everything that's Azure SQL wise is evergreen in terms of the backend SQL engine is always being updated for you behind the scenes. Now that being said, you can actually set your database compatibility level. So the engine's always going to continue updating, but you can say your database, hey, I'm not ready to move the next kind of version of SQL in the backend. I'm going to kind of set that statically so that, because I know without a shadow of doubt that that's going to work. Now and the idea there is that as Microsoft moves that forward in the backend, when you have database compatibility mode in a specific version that you're on, you will not have any regression issues as things go forward with the SQL engine, which is really a great feature there to minimize any sort of impact. And then you can just allow it to just update the background and move that database compatibility level up at your own leisure. The other thing too, you get 4 nines SLA out of the box, which is pretty huge. Built-in intelligent performance and security as well. And the intent here is that with managed instance, you really don't have to have many, if any, code changes to your applications at all, because you're just pointing it to a different, here's my new connection string over here, right? So when you get down to Azure SQL, the database side, so the single type databases there's really some incredible capabilities there around activity and performance with large workloads. So in most other cases, you're looking at usually a 4 or 8 terabyte size for the database itself or the entire instance in a managed instance perspective. That's just kind of some of the limits that there are in place there. But if you really need to have a lot larger databases there, and you'd like to run those in Azure, there's support for 100 terabyte plus with Hyperscale. So that runs off of the single database type level, and it's basically decouples the compute from the storage, so you can scale up the compute, scale up and down the compute, irrespective of the storage. And I mean, even restores are super quick, and there's some really great stuff that Microsoft's put together with this. And this is fully managed, right? So again, this is great for multi-tenant apps, especially, and you can build this in a preferred environment. So what this looks like is you can dynamically adapt the storage of your workloads, auto scaling up to 100 terabytes, so you don't even have to manage that storage in that case of having to, we need more storage, let's add more, right? Like if you're on a SQL Server, you have to add more disks once you're running out of storage. And you can provision 1 or more additional compute nodes that can serve even as a read-only workload and have them as a hot standby in case of a failover. So very flexible in that way, where you can have the redundancy you need and or read-only kind of workloads, so that you're not impacting, if you're writing to the database, for example. So if you're, pulling reports from that, right, or doing some ETL into a data warehouse, for example. You perform operations in constant time, really regardless of the size of the data operation, because of the scale and the decoupling of the compute, because you can scale up compute resources as needed. And it's very rapid in terms of scaling without having to lose any performance. Now you're probably thinking, all right, well, which one do I choose here? There's all these options already. So we're going to take a look at this a little bit deeper in terms of what options you have. So you're starting on the left side here, you have SQL Server on-prem. So at that point, you have 2 directions you can go. Let's just start with the bottom one, right? First off, if you're on an older version of SQL Server prior to like 2017 or 2019, you can take advantage of some really great new capabilities and features that have come out, recently, by just upgrading to something that's like, SQL Server 2019, for example, right? Now, what we're talking about today is more to do with moving things to the cloud. So let's go up at the top of the tree here, modernizing to Azure. So on the top right there, the first option is move to PaaS with Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, right? This would also be, maybe there's another option here that's moved to potentially Azure SQL Database itself, the single or elastic pool. Now for Managed Instance, like I mentioned before, it's a lift and shift for that. And essentially, you don't have to change much. Ideally, you don't have to change much in your database, and you can use some of the tools like Database Migration Service to get there. And then the other option is, well, maybe there are some compatibility issues, and you just don't have enough time, or you don't have the budget to get those things remediated. And maybe you're moving some other things like applications already to Azure. Well, your other option is to just move it to IaaS, just as is. So using lift and shift to a VM. So either kind of copying the disks and moving that up using something like Azure Migrate, or standing up a new SQL Server using Database Migration Service to migrate the databases. Beauty of this is, especially if you're on older versions of SQL with 2008, you can immediately get more extended security updates for free for still about another 1.5 years, even if you kept everything on 2008 or 2008 R2 for SQL. So here's a little deeper. So why choose Azure SQL Database Managed Instance? You would want to choose that if you do want to reduce or eliminate the database administration tasks. So the idea here is that this is fully managed. and there's less time they have to spend on kind of managing, maintaining the database service because Microsoft's doing it for you, and managing the updates and the patching because it's evergreen, or dealing with the end of support, right? That's all kind of built in. Also, you choose that if you use SQL Server for applications or data warehouse, right? It's the full surface area of the database engine for SQL Server. It's everything you need for your applications that are already using SQL today. And this is where you get some of the best ROI for managed SQL in the cloud too. Now, so I've mentioned before, if you want to choose the SQL virtual machine right now with just a VM, right? If your software application vendor, if they require a specific SQL Server version, operating system, or configuration, so especially for third-party applications, you may be restricted by your support contract, kind of like, oh, we only support a VM with SQL with this first specific version on it. We don't support putting it on managed instance or any other Azure SQL PaaS service, if you will. We've seen that sometimes those vendors come along, sometimes they don't, right? So you may need to do that if that's the vendor kind of support clause there. And the other thing too, you're still going to need to use SQL Server, kind of Azure SQL Virtual Machine, if you're using other kind of tools like reporting services, SQL Server analysis services, SQL Server integration services. Those still need to be on a VM if you need to run those specific services. And a lot of times what we'll see is some customers will move their databases, their relational part, right, to SQL Database managed instance while leaving reporting services, SSIS, those type SSAS on a VM still in Azure right next to it. Right, so that is an option there. For all three of those, SSRS, SSAS, and SSIS, there are solutions in Azure, which I would say it's more of a refactory architect to get to them. But for example, like SSRS with reporting, you look at something like Power BI, SQL Server analysis services. There's Azure analysis services that kind of similar to that. And for integration services, there's Azure Data Factory, which now can actually run SSIS packages. So you can move some of those to other PaaS services if you so desire to. Now, how do you buy SQL in Azure? Right, so you can just do pay-as-you-go pricing for SQL in Azure monthly. Essentially, there's a couple components there. There's compute components and there's licensing components. So the compute components, you can do pay-as-you-go. You can purchase reserved capacity to kind of commit to a certain term, and you'll get better pricing on that for the compute. And then for the licensing, you can either use a SQL Server subscription license, or if you already have some of your own SQL licenses today with software assurance, you can utilize them to offset the licensing costs in Azure, which is great. So a lot of different great options here, and that's really how you gain the efficiencies, the cost savings, is taking advantage of those types of things around licenses. So now we kind of talked about overall, what are the options here? Let's talk about the migration strategy. So this is going to be a little high level. We're going to go into this a lot deeper in future sessions. So to start off with, I like to start here because this is really how we approach everything when we're talking about moving anything to Azure. You need to start with the cloud adoption framework here. And this is built by Microsoft. It's all public documentation. And this is something that Cortex specifically follows because we see a lot of value here of consistency and proven success. So you start from defining your strategy, why you're moving, right, and what you're moving there. Then a plan is more of like, what are you moving? How are you aligned? Making sure you have the right skills and the plans together. Then you get into a ready phase of you need to stand up that first kind of the landing zone, getting ready to prior to pre-migration, basically, all the kind of constructs there, networking, security, governance, all the kind of initial things that you need to support a migration and ongoing operations, and then adopt. And that's where you're actually performing the migration. And underneath is govern and manage, which kind of ties into a lot of these sessions here too. So just want to give you an idea. That's kind of how we look at this. We're going to see this kind of in view of what we're looking at for migration here. It's going to be kind of tied to the CAF. So specifically the migration process for SQL, you're going to start with assessing. So you have to assess every asset associated with the workload being migrated. And the idea is to determine suitability for migration and which approach of the 5 R's, which I'll get into the next slide, to consider. So that's, rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, replace. So once you decide, all right, what do we want to move? We want to move these workloads. Okay, what other workloads are they tied to? So usually you don't just have a SQL Server and that's ever all it does, it doesn't talk to anything else. Usually there's an application. Maybe it's a 2-tier, 3-tier application where there's a front end and there's a middle tier with business logic and then the back end with the database. So typically you want to keep all those together. So you'd want to kind of look at your estate, see what is connected to what, and then kind of use the decision guide to determine how to analyze those and what to do. Once you determined out what you want to do, then you migrate. And you use a combination of native and third-party tools for this. These tools can include, like from Azure's Azure Migrate, especially if you're going to do just a lift and shift of a SQL VM, or Azure Database Migration Service, which is a free service from Microsoft that can move those databases either from a SQL VM to a SQL VM in Azure, or SQL VM to Azure SQL Managed Instance, or Azure SQL Database. And there's some other tools available too, but those are the kind of the main ones we see a lot. And then once you get everything there, you want to optimize, right? You may have just performed a rehost, right? That lift and shift initially, and then you're like, you know what? Now we want to take a look at this and refactor and modernize now to SQL Managed Instance or Azure SQL Database, right? Because it's a journey, and you can start wherever you need to start and just continue that journey. Then you want to resize the VMs, make sure that everything's kind of set up optimally for performance and cost. And then lastly, it's just making sure you're having everything is secured and managed on that. So the 5 R's of rationalization, you might have seen this before. I think Gartner coined this maybe. So the ones we're really going to focus on mostly is rehost, refactor, re-architect. Rehosting is that strict lift and shift. That's again from VM to VM. Microsoft still considers that as like VM to Azure SQL Managed Instance, because there's really, the intent is you're not really changing anything up. It's going to be pretty much the same thing, moving to Azure SQL Managed Instance. If you're going to move to Azure SQL Database, that's more of a refactor, may require re-architect if there are some pretty major changes that need to be done there. And then also in some scenarios, you might want to say, we're going to rebuild our app from the ground up. And that's the opportunity to start cloud native and use Azure SQL Database, for example, Hyperscale and those types of things. And so it's another view here of the tools and services for the migration journey here. So taking, different on-prem kind of database workloads there. And you can even do this from, looks like AWS or Google Cloud if you have SQL databases there too. You're going to run an assessment on there. Typically, we're running the Data Migration Assistant tool. That tool is going to be looking at basically the schema and the features that are being used on your current SQL databases and comparing that to, okay, how compatible is that with Azure SQL Managed Instance? How compatible is that with Azure SQL Database? Right. So you can get an idea of how much effort would there be required here, because there's going to have to be some decisions being made around, well, let's say we have these, say 50 databases, right? And all of them are a little bit different, maybe for different applications. You might want to run this tool against kind of each unique kind of schema and feature set to get an idea of like which ones are maybe the least amount of effort to move over, which ones are going to require a little more time, and make some decisions around, do we move those directly to Managed Instance or to Azure SQL Database, or do we just keep them on a VM? Right, that's going to help you definitely we gather that information every time we look at migrating anything with SQL outside of just doing a lift and shift VM to VM. And other tools there you're going to see, especially like the SQL Server Migration Assistant, that helps with other things like from Oracle to SQL, MySQL, those types of workloads. And then basically from a migration, Azure Database Migration Service is an online service. Beauty of it too is that you can do an online migration or offline migration. Now offline is you're basically kind of taking a backup and then you're doing a restore. So there's going to be some sort of a little bit of a gap there. You have to kind of a maintenance window, but you can also do an online migration, which is really great because there's little to no impact and loss of use of the database, because it's kind of copying everything up there and doing the deltas until you're ready to cut it over, which is really nice. You can do that on your schedule there, which is great. So that's kind of a high level of what the migration journey looks like. So I want to get into kind of future topics, knowing this is our first one in the series. I'll give you an idea and a taste of where we're going with this. And so the next webinar I'm thinking is going to be more of a deeper dive into migrating SQL to Azure, and really going to be using the CAF, the Cloud Adoption Framework data migration kind of guidance there for that. Going to get into more of the tooling, ideally show some demos, and and what that's going to look like, and some other considerations when you're thinking about how you're going to go and migrate these databases. And then other topics I'm thinking of, it's just going to be part 3 to who knows, right? maybe 5 parts, 6 parts, right? There's a lot of information out there that's great about SQL. So going to try to do as many of these as we can. So one of them I'm thinking of is redundancy and resiliency, plus a licensing review in terms of that, in terms of DR and backups and how you make sure you have high availability. That would be Azure SQL performance features that are built in the PaaS services, data security and governance features, like the encryption capabilities, data masking, a lot of those capabilities around governance too, compliance features. There's a lot of good stuff in SQL and Azure. And I do want to kind of call out too, I've done a couple webinars in our series, Tech Tuesday series, so head over to the YouTube page like I mentioned earlier, that are called Demystifying Microsoft Licensing in Azure. There's a part 1 and part 2. Both of them have some aspects of SQL licensing in Azure in there. So I am going to do a licensing review, I think probably in part 3 of some of the specifics there. But if you really want to get some really good information right away around licensing SQL and Azure, I highly recommend you check out those previous webinars. All right, so that's kind of all I have for us today. Kevin, was there any questions that everybody has?
We don't have any currently in the Q&A session, but there's still a little bit of time here. I know you did a great job going through a lot of material there, so we do have some time here before 3. So as we sort of close things out, again, the Q&A feature is up towards the upper right-hand side of the screen. If you do have a question you'd like to pop in, we can potentially get that answered for you, or it could be something that we could get potentially worked into one of the future parts of the series if it's a real question where Chris can really elaborate on it, we can definitely get it for you answered outside of the webinar too. So please don't hesitate to submit any questions if you do have them.
For sure. Yeah, and basically again, thank you for joining us as well. I mean, the intent here too is that Cortec works with a lot of customers in a lot of different areas, to industries and sizes in Azure, and if you're looking at starting your Azure kind of cloud journey or continuing it, doing something different, that's something that Cortec can definitely help you with. We have a lot of skilled migration expertise, and not only can we help you with migrations, we can help with kind of ongoing management of those resources as well in Azure to even further offload your kind of the operational needs and efforts that you have to put into basically keeping things running in Azure. All right, looks like we're actually seeing a couple. Okay, looks like there's a question here about seeing clients with a lot of shadow IT and access. Okay, so yeah, I've seen that too. So with Microsoft Access, because the whole idea, it's kind of it's interesting the way Microsoft even introduced that, was the idea that it's a database that's kind of meant for your users to go just create the database without having to bother IT. Right? But it kind of lends itself to shadow IT because they're off creating their own applications and doing what they want with that. So where I see that is typically I see 2 paths from there, either from a more IT-centric path, and this comes down to like control, like who has the control? Is it IT or is it the kind of the end, more or less kind of end users or citizen developers, if you will? On the IT side, traditionally be moving that potentially Microsoft Access into a SQL database that's, instead of just sitting out there on a data share, somewhere, you need something that's highly performant and scalable and secure, and having all the, rights accesses all set up with that. You could move Microsoft Access in most cases into a SQL database, and a lot of times, again, you have to look at how this looks like in terms of what you're using in Microsoft Access versus what SQL option you have to have. Again, needs some sort of assessment there. So that's one option. But what's really interesting, where I'm seeing a lot of traction, is if you stay on that citizen developer track there of enabling your end users to kind of build their own applications, because that's essentially what they're doing with Access. They're basically building their own application, is to use the Power Platform. And now Microsoft is calling it the Dataverse. Yes, Dataverse. It was Common Data Service. And the idea there is to enable your users to use something that's not just off on a file share on Microsoft Access, but it is a fully fledged SaaS database, essentially, that they can utilize to build their own front-end applications. It's a lot of tools around the Power Platform, or Power Automate, and Power Apps to tie back into that Dataverse, which that Dataverse is essentially, it's a database there, but it's very kind of simple to use. You don't have to be a DBA to use it. And that would be probably closest to the use case from a Microsoft Access perspective. I'd recommend you looking into that for sure. So that's a good question. Oh, good. We've got another good question here too. So when you decide for to go with a SQL instance, I'm assuming SQL managed instance, how does it affect your architecture for SQL loads? So separating reads versus writes versus, in premise, you have database replication, SQL traffic flows. All right, so essentially, we didn't get into this too deeply, but on the managed instance side, there are two different tiers of Azure SQL Managed Instance. There's a general purpose tier, and there is a business critical tier. Now, the general purpose tier, essentially how that works is there is a single kind of logical, let's call it logical server, SQL server running in the background with your instance, and it's sitting, and there's a remote storage that's connected to it. And the way that works is it's just one basically instance running there. And Microsoft allocates the RAM and the CPU that you said you wanted to that, and there's certain limits around performance on disks and that type of thing. But in any case, you really have just one instance that's running there. If that was to go down, another instance gets stood up really quickly and reattached to your remote storage. So that's kind of how redundancy works on that. So in that way, you can't really separate reads and writes there from a general purpose tier. But when you get into business critical tier, and this works not only managed instance, but also Azure SQL Database, so the single and elastic options too. When you get into the business critical tier, now you're looking at, in the back end, it's essentially an always on availability cluster, availability group rather, which means that there are at least 3 nodes that are running with local storage on those too, so it's a little bit faster in terms of storage performance, that are running like primary and a couple of secondaries, so that there's very quick kind of failover there. That's for more HA. But what you can also do with that is you can run a read-only, access node on top of that, which then allows you to segregate those reads and writes. So you can say, when you're making your queries, I want to hit the read-only, right? And it'll just going to go and hit that. So in that case, that's probably the best way in order to separate the reads and writes at that point. And like in the database replication and SQL traffic flows, that's all happening in the background. Microsoft basically manages all of that for you. And beyond that, we might have to wait till part 3. We'll see right about the redundancy and resiliency. Let's go one bit further. If you need to have replication across regions, there's active geo-replication as well that will even just kind of, it handles all the replication for you from that cluster, essentially in the primary region to a secondary region as well, with Azure SQL Managed Instance or Azure SQL Database as well too. So yeah, that's the best way. If you need to segregate the reads and the writes, I'd say business critical is probably the tier you're going to want to look at. So good question there. Okay. So not seeing any more questions here. I'll kind of wrap up. Feel free to reach out to us. I'm always happy to talk about anything that you might need in terms of Azure. You can hit us up at our kind of main email address at inquiry@coretech.com, or if you want to hit me up on LinkedIn, there's my LinkedIn there. Just make sure when you're connecting with me, just mention that you saw my webinar, and feel free to reach out. And I've actually had probably half dozen attendees in the last kind of few months reach out to me through LinkedIn because they saw a webinar of mine, and we're already kind of in talks with them and helping them along their cloud journey. So happy to see where we can help you as well. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And just as a reminder, we will be sending out today's recording so that you can take a look back at Chris's presentation, or if you are someone who signed up and are viewing it for the first time on demand, that'll give you access. So appreciate everyone's time. Chris, thank you. You were a great presenter as always, and we'll catch you during the next Tech Tuesday webinar.
Thanks, Ron.